reiterate, I think there are a lot of good things that we're going into here. I mentioned this Sunday, but just to repeat, I like the fact that Bryant goes through chapter 2, verse 16 on this section, because it helps me to really pull together this. I mean, in readings before, I've always just sort of thought, well, chapter 1 is the Gentiles, chapter 2 is the Jews. But that just sort of lumps this passage in chapter 2, 1 through 16, in with everything else. And you might miss the fact that this is all about sin and the necessity to recognize that sin. So we want to appreciate that and look through this section together. I'll just ask briefly, anybody have any thoughts or questions, anything that you looked at further in your studies concerning the first 17 verses of chapter 1? Anything we need to go back over? Murphy?
When I was looking at Brother Clinton Hamilton's comments, and I agree with him, I believe that verse 17 strongly argues for the fact that he's primarily talking to the Jew, because maybe he might, if we want to say he departs from that in verse 16, then he gets back to it in verse 17, where he says, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast in God."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a good bit about it. I mean, here's the thing. I think the way he phrases it and the way he approaches it, it almost sort of sets a trap for those who are self-righteous, right? Because they can cheer, oh yeah, those, and I think we all kind of have this sort of universal, like, of the other, the them, to kind of say, well, those are the people that have it wrong, but I've got it right. And then it flips around in chapter 2, verse 1. It's like, you are inexcusable, oh man. And so in that sense that his whole goal, I mean, again, that's a very solid point that, chapter 1 is not necessarily for the Gentiles. It's still geared toward the Jews, but it's helping them understand, like you say, like this core problem that all mankind suffers from. Do I get you right there?
Let's remember that the Jews' problem was really self-righteousness.
Yes.
They thought that they had it okay, and these wicked Gentiles over here, we're light years ahead of them spiritually because of all the advantages they had. Ain't going to get into the advantages that Jew has in chapter 3.
Yes, absolutely. And that of course begs us to take a look at ourselves, right? We want to make sure that doesn't describe us. So good points all. Anything else on verses 1 through 17? So let me quickly run through the rest. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm skipping ahead, actually. So the next section, again, really stretches from chapter 1, verses 18 to chapter 2, verse 16. And these were the headings that I had put together. Probably a little bit, certainly more as far as what Bryant had in his divisions here in the page. But just trying to kind of break it down. Did anybody have any particular section divisions that seemed interesting to you, or just main points that you might like to share that you had looked at in your study?
In this section we're fixing to go into, from 118 through 216, it shows how man went away from God. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember the verse in Ecclesiastes. I believe it's Ecclesiastes. It says, I'll paraphrase what it says. This I have seen, that God has made man upright, but man has sought out many inventions to leave that thing. And this right here bears it out.
Absolutely. And that's kind of where, the situation is there in 18 through 20. Here's how God is. 21 through 23, here's what they started doing. Here's what they rejected and what they started going down into. the result is 24 through 28, God gave them up. And then 29 through 32, here's what God thinks of what they're doing and what they're accomplishing. And then, of course, 1 through 3, you have no excuse. You're not removed from this accusation. 4 through 11, how are you living? What are you building up? What are you treasuring? Right? And then 12 through 16, really speaking concerning the law and judgment and how all of that works together. So, good point. Appreciate that input there. Anything else? Let's look at the verses. Let's read through verses. Let's just do 18 through 20 right now, and we'll go from there. 18 through 20. And I'd like to ask Al, if you would, to read those.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes have been seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.
Okay, so they are without excuse, verse 18. And of course, we know that's going to lead up to chapter 2, verse 1. You are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. He speaks in this fashion. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. It's interesting, too, because when Jesus is kind of cornered by the Jews about the authority that he had to cleanse the temple, what did he ask them about the baptism of John?
Was it from heaven or from men?
From heaven or from men. And we realize, we recognize when we look at that passage that those are the two sources of authority. Authority either comes from heaven, God, or it comes from men. And so in this passage, we're talking about the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. I want to keep in mind, too, and I think I mentioned this Sunday, but this is not an emotional wrath, per se. This is not God losing his temper, just out of control. No, this is a judgment wrath. This is a legal wrath. It's like this is antithetical to his nature. He can't go along with this. And so there has to be a particular reaction. There has to be something done. And that wrath is revealed from heaven. That's the source, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. I like a lot of the things that, a lot of the breakdowns that Robertson Whiteside has. I like how he talks about godliness and ungodliness and unrighteousness. And the definitions, I think, are really important to look at. Godliness could be defined as piety or reverence. In fact, I've done this before, too, of making the mistake to say, well, this is being like God, godlikeness, godliness. But that really doesn't bear out in the Greek. The Greek really speaks more of this thought of piety, reverence, the right attitude toward God, is essentially what I would say. It's not an attitude that treats God as a very light thing. I don't care, whatever he wants to do with me, he'll do, And we see some people in the Bible, acting in such a way toward God in a very light manner. And sometimes we see some really bad things happen to them because of that attitude. Ungodliness seems to be the main problem. That is, that's defined as impiety, irreverence, lack of respect for God and that which is sacred, the things that God has, the things that belong to God. Ungodliness, that's the problem. This is the wrong attitude toward God. And I've heard Sewell Hall mention that word attitude in terms of an airplane. And when the first time I heard him say this, I was like, no, you're talking about altitude. And he's like, no, it's attitude. Attitude is the direction of the plane. You're either going up or you're going down. And in terms of how God is, we want to constantly be going up. We want to get closer to him. And that is the goal. And it's interesting to note how core this is. When we define unrighteousness, I think there's a sense there where it's just injustice. And it's interesting here too, because this is not just unrighteousness in terms of man in relationship to God, the word seems to speak more toward injustice toward your fellow man and each other. And that is such an important link, because ungodliness, this improper, wrong attitude about God, you live your life in that way, and it begins to affect others in your life, whether you intend it to or not. And in fact, I think there's a good breakdown here. When you think about this fact, so those who do unrighteous things can still be godly in their attitude. And you may not immediately agree with that statement, but think about David. David did some really horrible things. I mean, you're taking a guy who is your faithful soldier. You're going to put him in the front of the battle lines intentionally, hoping that he dies so you can get his wife. What a horrible thing to do. Ungodly, I would say. But David was godly in his attitude when he realized what he had done. When Nathan made it clear, this is what you did, what's his immediate thing? I've sinned before the Lord. So he had the right kind of reaction. The godly attitude of that person leads them to repent, even though they've done something unrighteous. But the problem when someone is ungodly in their attitude, they're not going to repent. Whatever righteous deeds they do, they will still be unrighteous. We have a lot of people in this world that do a lot of good things, a lot of charitable things, a lot of helpful things. And that's good. But they're not going to charity their way into heaven. And we all have to deal with this problem, right? Who is God and who should I be in relationship to him? And what does that mean for me? And it's said as well that it's more often that ungodliness is what destroys churches than unrighteousness. Unrighteousness comes in actions, right? And we can deal with those. Even if someone does something unrighteous, yeah, but if we have an attitude that is ungodly, that is not reverent toward the things that God cares about, that's going to spell the end of a local church. And so we want to have a godly attitude. Because that's what's happening here. And it's interesting too, verse 18, what comes out of it? They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So again, this isn't saying, by no means are we saying unrighteousness is okay. But the dividing line here is, do you have a godly or an ungodly attitude? Because the actions that we take are going to be unrighteous from time to time. And we have to be able to see that with a godly attitude in order to correct them. And that leads to this thought, suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. An ungodly attitude will avoid the truth. It's the same thing as Jesus talks about in John chapter 3. Those who do wickedness hate the light. They don't come to it, lest their deeds be found out. So that's the distinction here that I would suggest. Further, God is manifest, verse 19, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. Somebody else have a different translation on that in terms of what may be known of God is manifest in them? Any different? Anybody have any different?
Evident.
Evident, yeah. The evidence is there in them, isn't it? Concerning who God is. God has shown it to them. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about this section here. This is talking about those that are without God, right? Those that are Gentile and
right,
without God.
yeah.
Okay.
It's pulling together all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And so, yeah, I think those who are allied with God and working for him, they wouldn't be tied in with this. Now, again, our Calvinist friends might suggest differently and say, well, we're still sinners, but God clothes us. But again, it's hard to really prove that with what the New Testament says. And in fact, giving the fact that the unrighteousness of men, God's wrath is revealed against that. The evil works of men, the ungodliness, the irreverent, impious attitude toward God. And so, yeah, I think this is looking at that for sure. But the other thing that we keep in mind, if we remember our Bible and keep in mind what has happened, how has God revealed himself and manifested himself over time? Back in Genesis 6, everyone in the world, his family rejected God. I think I've mentioned in our Genesis study, in the Zoom study, that one of the themes of Genesis is that God allows himself to be forgotten. God allows himself to be cast aside. And he allows mankind to move ahead without him. But Noah remembered him, and Noah kept him in mind. You think about Pharaoh in Exodus 9:16. We remember that Pharaoh rejected God. Who is this God that I should do what he says? And then here's an interesting thing too. Remember in Joshua 2, look over there with me real quick. Joshua 2. And here's the fascinating thing. I think about the fact that, he says in verse 18 that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That doesn't defeat the truth. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. That suppression is not mankind. We cannot completely suppress the truth as far as all existence. Joshua 2 and verse 10, remember what Rahab said to the spies. In verse 10, we have heard now the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God, in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness to my father's house. Give me a true token, spare my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So the men answered her, our lives are yours. Again, they promised to take care of her. Interestingly, an ancestor of Jesus saying these things, which is fascinating. But you think about Rahab and what she was, and the what she knew. Now, think about the Egyptians wouldn't have wanted this story to go out, would they have? But it seems like they couldn't stop it from reaching up into that land. So no matter how much the wicked may try to suppress the truth will always be there. Of course, all throughout the Bible, we have many other various witnesses of God manifesting himself to various people. Melchizedek, Jethro, Job, Balaam, people that are not directly connected to the children of Israel as far as we can tell. I mean, even with Job, it seems like he's a good man, but that's about all we know of him. There's not a whole lot of connection we can make there, but Balaam himself, he's not necessarily an Israelite, but he's a prophet necessarily. Now, of course, there's a later point where he turns totally against God, but my point is that there's something there. And this actually reached into the first century per the post-exile Israel. The fact that Israel existed, that there was this people that carried on this worship in the ancient world, that completely and totally within itself, that worship prophesied the Messiah and the nature of that closeness with God, that invitation of salvation. All of that was shadowed by the old law, wasn't it? And so the fact that that's there is proof enough that there's something to this. And so it inclines our ears to think about that, how God indeed did manifest himself to mankind. And so we know and we see God has shown it to them. How did he show it to them? All throughout time. He's shown it to mankind. And even more than that, verse 20 goes into his invisible attributes. I think we let the verse define what those invisible attributes are, right? Because even his eternal power and Godhead, so they're without excuse. I think that's what we're talking about. His invisible attributes of his eternal power and Godhead. Those are not things that I can explain about God, but I know they're true based on what he says. Yes, sir.
Well, I presented a lesson not too long ago, and it dealt with that God is evident in man in that there are many things you can admire beauty. Those are things that just naturally occur. You know, somebody doesn't have to come to you and say, when you're a kid, you know when something is beautiful. And there are a lot of things that's in you that lets you know that God made you and that there's something special about the way you're made and the way you think. Now you can cover that up with different habits and attitudes and things like that. But if you're left at your own devices, there's a lot of things you realize. Shame, for instance. You can feel shame, and you may not know why you feel shame, but you have that in you.
That's true. And like I mentioned with Psalm 19, 1 through 4, if you've ever been out in the country and able to look on a clear night up at the sky, you know, again, you know, creation doesn't tell us anything particularly about, you know, how to be saved and how to behave and how to live, but it tells us that there's something there, that there's order in the universe, that this didn't come out of nowhere. And we remember this passage, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And that's why I call that the vast and silent witness of the universe. It's you can see in the heavens that there's something there. That this did not come out random chance events. So, yeah. And so look also in Acts 14. Acts 14. Here's the thing. There's no reason that anyone should ever have forgotten God. I mentioned earlier that God allows himself to be forgotten, but there's never any proper reason to forget God. In Acts 14, in verse 7, 17, I'm sorry. Thank you. I was getting confused. So remember, this is Barnabas and Paul speaking to the people in Lystra. And they say in verse 17, nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And that was something to tell them, like, we've all benefited from this. And yeah, that's probably a pretty interesting and important verse to put beside Jesus saying it rains on the just and the unjust. Because here's the thing, it still rains. That's the great blessing, is that you know, God doesn't have to do these things. It is his grace. And so there is something manifested there. Any comments or thoughts there? I guess I should also deal with our question here. How is the wrath of God revealed? We talked about that from heaven. Speaks toward authority as well. I didn't mention that specifically, except the authority from heaven. And so why are we without excuse?
It's from the creation. All the attributes of God have been clearly seen and understood.
Yeah. If we were just left here with nothing to go on, then that would be one thing. But there's something there. Yeah.
You would have to think before Jesus and before Abraham that all men sprang from the same thing, and God told them. And that day, although we don't have complete records of it, he told them what they needed to do, whether how would Abel and Cain, how would they have known what to sacrifice unless they were told?
Right.
Now that got lost in the centuries, but there was a time that they knew there was a God.
Yes. Yeah, and that is the core part of this, and why I would say, like, these people who were not part of the covenant of Israel, they were under a covenant with God, you know, from way back. And I think that's part of what Paul is saying here. 21 through 28, let's read that together. 21 through 28. Back in back in Romans 1. Who'd like to read that? Ken?
Romans 1, 21 through 28.
21 through 28, yes, sir.
Because it, pardon me, knowing God, they glorified him not as God, neither gave thanks, but became vain in their reasonings, and their senseless heart was darkened. Professing themselves to become wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God for the likeness of an image of corruptible man, or birds, or four-footed beasts, or creeping things. Wherefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts unto uncleanness, that their bodies should be dishonored among themselves, for that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this cause God gave them up to vile passions, for their women changed the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lusts one toward another, men with men, working unseemliness, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was due.
No, that's fine. Yeah, you can include verse 28. Yes, sir.
Okay. And even as they refused to have God in their knowledge, God gave them up unto a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not fitting.
Okay. And the unifying aspect there is, I'm looking at 3 times we see in that passage, God gave them up. There may be more that you see. Here's the thing to keep in mind. They knew him. They knew God. And just as Al was mentioning, these people who were Gentiles in the time of the first century, did they know God like their distant ancestors in the ancient of histories knew God? No, they didn't. But their peoples knew of God at one time. It's kind of like, you keep in mind, the gospel went to Ethiopia. But then, those black people who came over here, they didn't know God, right? So what conclusion do we have to come to? At some point, those people in Ethiopia rejected God, right? So that's just a natural conclusion. And it's that same thing everywhere in the world, though, is that at one point, everybody in the world came from Eve, and everybody had a source whereby they could learn and know of God. But at some point, that was rejected. The Jews, I think, were making an assumption that because of that, and I think that's something they would have known and kept in mind. I think they were thinking because of that, these people were just hopeless. There's nothing for them. Yes, sir.
That's why Scripture says, in the fullness of time.
Yes. Yes.
You got to a point that if Christ didn't come, I think God would have absolutely destroyed the world right then. But Christ came and brought a new hope for all men, Gentile and Jew, could flow into him.
And I say the Jews thought they had no hope. I think the only hope that they thought the Gentiles had was to become proselytes and to embrace the law. Salvation is of the law. But that's part of what Paul is fighting against. They knew him. They didn't reject him in ignorance. The question here, how is God's glory exchanged and why? And what are the consequences? So let's go with the first one. How is God's glory exchanged and why in this passage?
They changed.
Go ahead, John, and then Murphy.
They changed the glory of God into an idol. And B, they changed the truth for a lie. And they worshiped the idol rather than God. And the C part, God gave them up because of sin, to be debased, to have a debased mind, and to do the sins which are not good.
Absolutely. Murphy?
Basically, something.
Okay. So I think that is a big part of it, right? They changed the glory of the incorruptible God. Does that mean they literally changed the glory of God? No. They did that for themselves. Their glory became these things that were corruptible. their adoration was poured onto lesser beings, you might say. And then you go forward and you keep in mind, too, professing to be wise, they became fools. And that's why, again, you could have the most educated person, university-educated person in the world, but they'll be clueless in terms of what the Bible actually says, because they don't apply themselves to look at it for what it says it is. They have to look at the biases that they've already learned from mankind. They profess to be wise, but in practice they're fools.
What is it in 1 Corinthians 2? Paul said the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God.
Yes.
They're foolish to him because they don't make sense to his five senses in the way he reads.
Right. Yeah, it has to come down to this material existence. That's why people who believe in terms of spontaneous evolution, all those other things, they have to believe that matter is eternal.
Yes.
And that's something, you don't get something from nothing in their mindset. That's just impossible. And so it's always a matter of changing that to the point that you might go ahead and just call them materialists. But the glorification of God, that really is core. Jesus mentions this in John 17 and verse 4. John 17 and verse 4, where he says, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. The work of mankind is to glorify God. And what this means is that these people took what was their purpose and twisted it to where they were no longer glorifying God. They were glorifying things other than God, lesser than God, beyond those things. And so that's what turns the so-called wise into fools. We have idolatry seeking to replace God. I like the ASV uses the term refused. When let's see, I'm trying to remember which verse that is. Anybody have the ASV open? NASB? I think in verse 21, I think that's what we're talking about here. Nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And then the sense where God gave them up to these things, essentially be that they tested God and they examined him, but they threw him out. They tested him not in the sense of like, I hope he passes the test. They tested him in such a way that, well, no, that's not what I want. And so they disregarded God. Now I apologize. I should have put a verse on the ASV point there. There is a word in there in the ASV for refused at some point.
What
And
verse
that's
we talking about? I got ASV here, right?
okay. I'm not quite sure.
128.
20?
128.
28?
Oh, 128, okay.
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And
Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge.
Yeah.
That's the testing aspect, is they tested God, they refused him, and gave him up. And so that's part of what's going on here. I can't have a relationship with somebody unless they want to have that relationship. So God giving them up is not just some spontaneous, absurd thing about like, well, I'm just randomly going to toss these people out. No, it's a matter of, you don't want anything to do with me. And if that's the case, I'm going to give you up. I'm going to let you have what you want. And that's part of reality, right? God will allow me to pursue whatever course I want to in this world. Yes, sir.
Is that not parallel to what Paul said, that if you do not receive the love of the truth, God will send you a work in the very that you might be condemned?
Yeah, I think he lets you go to that point, right? And that kind of goes into that next section in terms of what they are doing. And he's allowing them to continue in those things. So they tested God and they threw him out. Verses 29 through 32, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. What does this list reveal about the nature of God's view of sin? Doesn't like it. Yeah.
All worthy of death.
Yeah, the things that they're doing, that's worthy of death in God's estimation.
All transgression is sin.
All transgression is sin.
But wouldn't this be a spiritual death, not a physical?
Right. I think, in some sense, I think the physical death is still called upon, possibly, if God were to meet it out that way. I mean, it's up to Him, because you do have some points where, remember, the story of Israel's sons and their family troubles. There's a couple of times where you can see where one or two of them does wrong, and God strikes them down because of his wickedness. So they're, up to God's prerogative in terms of that. But yeah, I think primarily we're looking at spiritual death here. But yeah, this one thing that occurred to me, this list is not entirely offensive to the world. So the world is going to look at this list and say, some of this is not going to be really that much of a problem. How do you define unrighteousness, right? Some people would think about that. Sexual immorality is absolutely okay in our society. Nobody bats an eye about fornication, even though in the book of Genesis, you have a Pharaoh who's very concerned about fornication among his people. He wants to be right before God. That's fascinating in and of itself. Covetousness, malicious would generally say, okay, yeah, those things aren't good. Envy, murder, strife, deceit. But then, of course, we say we don't like those things, but we live with them. People live doing those things.
You just made me think of something. With all races, cultures, whatever, somewhere in their culture, they see sin, some of the sins that it talks about here, that's not right, and they don't allow it. But, when you talk about Jehovah God and all the other things that they probably allow, they don't think about that.
Right.
Where did they get that from? Doesn't that make you wonder?
Well, yeah, and I think there's a lot here that kind of tells you why. Deceit, evil-mindedness, that they're deceiving themselves,
Really?
Yeah. So that's a big part of it. Here's the thing, too. Violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things. People don't typically, I know people say we don't want violence, we don't like violence, but then you have violence that occurs, and it does that. Verse 31, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. Also disobedient to parents. Most people in the world would say, well, listen, my dad, hit me one time when I was a kid, and so I shouldn't have to listen to him or whatever. Okay, well, I'm sorry that happened. That's a horrible thing that he did to you. That doesn't mean he's not your daddy anymore. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Hey, discipline.
That's true.
I believe in not sparing the rod.
Yeah.
But I've had people say, well, that's talking about like a shepherd's rod, and you direct the sheep with it. I don't think that's what it's talking about.
Well, I think there are a lot of people in this world that would say, if there's a situation that has come about that you don't have to take care of your parents. I mean, the Jews were doing that, right?
Yeah, sure.
This is Corban. You've given it to the temple. You don't have to take care of your parents now. Well, that's not what God said. Al, did I see your hand? I'm sorry.
I was just looking at this list. If you think about what's being taught today and what's being enforced today, every bit of this is hate speech.
Yeah.
And Christian is going to have to make a decision sooner or later.
Yeah.
May not be in 9-year lifetime, but in this country, if things don't change, there will be a day when we will have to discern if we're going to stand against it or if we're going to have pleasure in those who do it. That's the problem here in Rome.
And what you're talking about is, Christians losing their jobs, Christians, being cast out by society, basically. All that is very, very possible. And it's already happening in other countries. So we want to keep that in mind. So again, these people, these Gentiles, these worldly people, they're still under a covenant with God. Paul is making it clear that sin is something from which everyone suffers. And I think that's the core message of this section. We don't have time to keep going tonight, but I would encourage you to keep looking into verses 1 through 16 and just think about how, the Jews, it was so easy for them to sidestep this, to say, well, they're the Gentiles and we're the Jews. It's a them and us, and I don't have to really act in a moral way in terms of them because the rules have changed, things are different for me, my situation is different. But it's like, well, no, we're all under the same God, and we're all called to live in a way that is in accordance with righteousness, with godliness, to have that focus. But I appreciate the thoughts and the questions. Anything else before we finish up tonight? All right, I'm grateful for your time. Thank you.